Morning, afternoon, or good evening, sir. This is Rear Admiral Draper L. Kauffman, the first frogman and EOD officer in the United States Navy by Midshipman 4th Class Ogden. So, Admiral Kauffman was born August 4th, 1911 in San Diego, California. He was the son of Vice Admiral James L. Kauffman, a World War I destroyer commander and surface warfare officer. He attended the St. Albans School in Washington, D.C. and the Kent School in Kent, Connecticut. He was going to receive a nomination to the Naval Academy from his senator in Connecticut, but the senator ended up passing away. So what Admiral Kauffman, or high school Admiral Kauffman, decided to do was rent out a room at the YMCA in Washington, D.C., and he told this kind of sad story to every congressman and senator he could find as he walked the halls of Congress until one of them kind of felt bad and accepted him, which was how he got his appointment to the Naval Academy in 1929 out of Ohio. Admiral Kauffman graduated in 1933 from the Naval Academy. However, his eyesight was so bad that they denied him his commission, and he was forced to work a desk job for the United States Steam Line Company. So here's a little career timeline for Commander Kauffman, and the badges symbolize, the different jobs that he had. And in 1933, he starts off at U.S. Lines, the steamship company, and they end up, as he's working for the steamship company, he ends up getting to Germany, and he sees what's going on with the rise of Adolf Hitler, and he decides to join the American Volunteer Ambulance Corps in France, and technically he becomes a private in the French army in addition to being an ambulance driver. So he's driving on the front lines in the Western Front, and on the 16th of June he was captured by Germans and held as prisoner for 2 months. After 2 months they released him and said, hey, if you promise never pick up arms again, then we can release you. And he got released and told himself, I got to make a change. So he goes to England and enlists in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserves and becomes a sub-lieutenant, which is the equivalent of an ensign. Another interesting story, he's Sub-Lieutenant Kauffman now is on leave in Washington, D.C., because that's where his father lives at the time. And his reputation is brought up by his dad's friend, Admiral Chester Nimitz. And he says, why aren't you diffusing bombs for the U.S. Navy? Because Sub-Lieutenant Kauffman was a bomb disposal officer in England, where at the height of the Blitz he was disposing bombs in London. And Sub-Lieutenant Kauffman replies to Admiral Nimitz, hey, my eyes aren't good enough, so they keep rejecting me. And that's where Admiral Nimitz gets this quote, well, they are now, symbolizing that, yeah, your eyes are good enough because, the U.S. needs to do a job of explosive ordnance disposal in the Pacific and Atlantic as they begin to enter the war, the World War II. And immediately after he's commissioned, since he is the only active EOD officer, EOD anything, he's the only active person who knows how to defuse bombs in the U.S. military, he is tasked with starting the U.S. Navy Bomb Disposal School in Florida. He's commissioned in November of 1941, and in December of 1941, December 15th, he's called to Pearl Harbor to defuse some unexploded ordnance after the Japanese attacks. And he's there, Lieutenant Kauffman now, unloading and examining a 500-pound Japanese bomb that's on the grounds at Fort Schofield, Oahu, And apparently he did it so well that he defused every single part of the bomb without exploding, and he was able to send it back to Washington, D.C. for them to analyze it. And that was in December 1941, where that explosive is. And then he was tasked, that's where he goes on to start the EOD school, where he's teaching other people how to defuse ordnance and to prepare for amphibious assaults in Europe and the Central Pacific campaigns. He is then tasked with establishing the Navy Combat Demolition Units School. Initially, they had a 5-week program designed by NFL players that got people in shape and ready to go, defuse bombs and scout out beaches. And he found that the war was developing so quickly that they didn't really have 5 weeks. So he said, hey, can we consolidate all of this into 1 week that simulates war and stress as best as possible? And that's where Hell Week comes from, is Lieutenant Commander Draper Kauffman consolidating UDT and NCDU training into one. One now Commander Kauffman's most infamous missions was where he was the founder of Hell Week. Now he's the founder of the RIB. It's one day prior to the amphibious assault on Saipan in 1944. He gets his UDT-5, his underwater demolition team, together, and they come up with this tactic to get to these beaches and be able to get to the shore so they can do some reconnaissance and bring that intel back to prepare for the amphibious assault the next day. And they come up with the idea of getting these floating mattresses, which you can see right here, and they add battery-powered propellers to the back. Very similar to a RIB, maybe a little smaller. And they get 2 UDT prepped operators ready to go, and the UDT team rides in these mattresses about 1,000 yards from the shore, jumps off with their rebreathers and their gear, swim up. They're exposed to enemy fire, so they got machine gun rounds coming into the water, and they're swimming, getting to the shore. They do the reconnaissance at 0900. They thought they were going to have close air support, but that was unavailable. So all they could have was battleship bombardment from the battleships behind them. They did the reconnaissance, and they got back on the mattresses, and they headed back to the battleships. That wasn't the end of the mission, though. As commander of UDT-5, Draper Kauffman was made aware that after the mission, 2 of the members of his team were missing, and he took it upon himself to get back on the flying mattresses, go out. He's a selfless leader, and he goes back. He's under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. He finds his 2 men, puts them on the precursor to the RIBs, and he gets them back safely, which is where he earns his 2nd Naval Cross. The first one was in Hawaii for doing the first explosive ordnance disposal in U.S. history. And now it's here exemplifying the part of the Navy SEAL ethos where you never leave another one of your Navy SEAL brothers behind. Following his career in World War II, which is really where the bulk of his career was, he was tasked by Congress. They saw his success in Britain with explosive ordnance disposal, and due to the tight coalition between the United States and Britain, the United States was kind of inspired to start doing EOD on their own so that they could help on the European and Pacific campaigns of World War II. Following his post-World War II career, he commanded several destroyers, destroyer divisions, and flotillas, which is ultimately what he wanted to go to the Naval Academy to do in the first place, very similar to his father. He was then instructed to go to the Naval War College to study strategy and tactics, and they kept him there for 6 months after he graduated to stay on the staff and to teach the next generation of officers about strategy and tactics. And they saw his experience using improvised technology as the first of his field to kind of do so, and they understood that he was an ideal teacher for that. He then joined the Strategic Plans Division under the CNO, further helping in the 1950s to advise the strategy regarding the war in Korea and the enhanced tensions in the Pacific. He then became the aide to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of the Navy. Kind of a more desk role than he's had previously, interacting with the manpower side of the Navy now instead of the operational side. And as he gets on this manpower side, he goes back, Assistant Chief of Staff for Plans in the Pacific. So he's back on operations, pretty much continuing the path of Strategic Plans Division under the CNO, but with more of a Pacific focus this time. In July of 1960, he's selected for Rear Admiral, and he becomes the Chief of Strategic Plans, the office that he worked for earlier. So now he's just over, I think it's N3, N5 at the Pentagon, and he's the overseer for that in the U.S. Navy. He then becomes the 44th Superintendent of the Naval Academy. The midshipman that they failed to commission has come back, and now he's overlooking those who were once in his shoes. And following that, he gets a belt that his dad held 44 years prior, Commander, U.S. Naval Forces, Philippines. And one of the most important things that this shows is Commander Kauffman's versatility, or Admiral Kauffman's versatility. He could be an EOD operator, he could be an EOD instructor, he can be a teacher of strategy and tactics, he could be an aide to the Secretary of the Navy regarding manpower, he could oversee the education of midshipmen, he could be a destroyer flotilla commander, and he can also command U.S. Naval Forces in the Philippines. And then finally, going back to his sort of educational instructor role, he is the commander of Naval Station Great Lakes, where the training of enlisted personnel takes place for the Navy. So that is Rear Admiral Draper L. Kauffman, the father of underwater demolition and SEAL teams. Thank you.